a repository is public or private. If it's public, anybody can see it. If it's private, then only you can see it. We're going to keep it as public. Don't worry, if you decide to change it in the future, you can change it to private. However, it does make a few things a little bit easier when it's public. So I'm going to leave this as public, and then we're going to leave all of these unchecked. They don't really matter. And we'll select Create Repository. And then you'll see that it's going to give us a couple of steps to follow. So if we haven't already set up Git for our project, these are the instructions we're going to follow. And if we've already set up Git in our project folder, then we can follow these steps. However, we haven't set up Git yet, so we're going to, for the most part, follow along here. But we're going to modify it just a little bit because we don't need to run some of these commands. So go ahead and open up your project in VS Code like you normally do. Then open up your terminal, and we're going to follow these steps, but we're going to ignore the first one. We don't need a README for now. But we are going to do a git init, which is going to initialize Git for our project. And so make sure you're at the root directory of your project. So whatever this is called right here at the top, make sure that's where you're at. And just do a git init. That's going to initialize Git. And you may not see anything different about your folders, but I think it's because VS Code actually hides the Git folder. But when you actually did a git init, if you open up this your project directory and you click on View here and then make sure you select Hidden Items, you'll see that it created a .git folder. So this is where it stores all of the Git information. Then we're going to skip this git add readme. Instead, what we're going to do is we're going to run git add --all. So this is going to add all of the files that we have in our directory into Git. All right, and you'll get a couple of warnings potentially. Don't worry about that. Those won't create any issues. Then we have to commit our changes. So anytime you add a file, you then have to commit it. So we'll say git commit -m. So the -m means we're going to provide a message. So you usually give a message for each commit to kind of describe what changes you're making. So we're just going to call this initial commit. All right. And you'll see that we probably get an error if this is the first time you've ever worked with Git. And that's okay. It's just telling us, hey, we need to set up our user for our account on this machine. So we're just going to run this command right here. And then we're just going to provide the email that we use to register for GitHub. So I'll say git config --global user.email. All right, we set that, and then it's telling us to also set our name. So we'll do that as well. Then we're going to run that same command, the git commit. So if you just hit the up arrow a couple of times, you'll get to that. All right, so we've committed those changes. Then what we need to do is we need to set what our branch is. So here, this is just going to set our main branch to be called main. And so we can copy that, paste it into here. Then we have to set up a remote branch. So this is what's going to allow us to store all of our code on GitHub. So we're just saying, like, hey, listen, this is going to be the remote Git repository, and we just provide a URL to it. And so that if you take a look at the URL, it's going to match up with this. And in this case, we're naming it origin. You can technically call it anything you want. So we'll add that. And then finally, we need to do a git push -u origin main. And so this means we're actually going to push all of our code up to GitHub. And you'll see a pop-up asking you to sign in. And there's a couple of things we can do. We can get a personal access token, or we can sign in with our browser. So I'm just going to sign in with our browser. And we just select authorize right here. All right, and it says it's succeeded. So we should be able to go back, and we can see that a couple of things changed. So it looks like, well, that's our authentication. And then you can see that we're pushing all of this stuff up to GitHub. And so at this point, you're pretty much done. All of your code is now stored in GitHub. And we can just verify that by going back to this page and just select the name of the repository again. And you'll see all of our code stored on GitHub now. So at this point, our repository is set up, and we can move on to deploying our application. In this lesson, we're going to take a look at the first of two deployment methods that we're going to cover in this course. So what we're going to do is we're going to deploy our application to a platform called Heroku. And the reason I wanted to make sure to have this as one of the deployment methods was that Heroku has a very generous free tier. And so we can create an account for free, and we can deploy our application absolutely for free without having to pay a single dollar, and we don't even have to provide our credit cards. And I wanted to make sure to add that just because I know for some of you guys that isn't exactly an option, and I wanted to make sure that you can still deploy your application and show off to your friends and family what you have created. And you'll see that Heroku has made it very easy to deploy your application, and it's very easy to push out changes to your application. It's a fantastic platform, and I think you guys will learn a lot on how to actually deploy an application by making use of a platform like Heroku. So we'll take a look at how we can, make use of Heroku, learn about the Heroku CLI so that we can push our application to the platform and ultimately have anyone be able to access our API. Heroku has a lot of really good tutorials on how to deploy applications on their platforms, and they've got one for Python as well. So if we go to Google, just search for Heroku Python, and the first result is going to be their tutorial. It's going to walk us step by step on how to actually deploy our application. But before we do that, there's a couple of things that we have to do. First of all, go ahead and create an account on Heroku if you haven't already done so. It's completely free, so just provide your email and so on. Then there's two other requirements. We have to have Git installed on our machine, which we've already done. And then finally, we have to install Heroku itself. So if you go to the setup section right here, you're going to see the installers for all of the different operating systems they support. So just select whichever operating system you have and get the Heroku CLI installed on your machine. And after you get it installed, usually you have to close out any of your pre-existing terminals and reopen them to actually be able to access the Heroku command. If you have VS Code, a lot of times I've had to just close out VS Code altogether, not just close the terminals, but actually close out the entire application and then open it back up. But after you've done that, if you want to verify if Heroku was successfully installed, just go to your terminal and just type in Heroku -- version. And if it spits out a version, that means Heroku has been successfully installed. And after it's been installed, we want to log in. So we do Heroku login. And then you just press any key right here. And it's going to open up your web browser. You can just log in and then provide your credentials. All right, and then once you're logged in, you can just close out this window. We'll go back to our code, and you can see logging in is done, and we've logged in, and then that's my specific account right there. All right, and once that's done, we're going to go back to the tutorial. And we're just going to kind of follow along. So if you go to prepare the app, you can ignore this. So they give you like a demo application to kind of follow through the tutorial, but we already have our own app, so we don't need to worry about that. If we go to deploy the app, we have to run this command Heroku create. So we have to create an app within our Heroku account. So let's run that command. But before we run that, I'm going to do a Heroku create -- help. And we can see that one of the arguments is going to be the name of the app we want to create. And so if you don't provide a name, Heroku just gives you a random name, but I always like to use a more familiar name so I know that which app covers which one of my applications. And so I'm going to call this Fast API Sanjeev. And keep in mind, these app names are global. So if I deploy my app as Fast API Sanjeev, you will not be able to create an app with the same exact name. And that's because to actually access our application once deployed, the URL is going to be the specific app name embedded in there. So it has to be globally unique. So if it says your app name is already taken, then just try a different one, maybe add a couple of numbers at the end. It doesn't really matter what the name is. All right, and once we've created our app, the next thing that we have to do is, well, actually, before we even do that, I want to show you guys what it actually did. So there's a couple things that happen behind the scenes. And the first thing is if we actually log into our account, I'm going to log in right here. Right, we're going to see our dashboard. So in the dashboard, you can see the application that we just created. Right now, there's nothing interesting. Nothing's been set up with it, so we don't actually see anything. But the second thing that it also did was if I type in git remote, this is going to show all of the remotes that have been set up for our Git. And we can see there's two now. So there's Origin, which is the one we set up originally, and that's GitHub ultimately. But Heroku added a second one. And so this is ultimately how we deploy our application, because instead of doing a git push origin main to push it out to GitHub, we can just do git push Heroku main, and that's going to push out our code to the Heroku platform, and then it will then create an instance for our application. So let's go ahead and do that. We're going to do a git push Heroku main. And this is going to take a little bit of a while because it's got to, set up Python. It's got to do a few other things. It's got to install all of our dependencies before it can actually get our app up and running. So I'm going to pause this video and then I'll touch base with you guys once that's complete. All right, so our application has successfully been deployed, and you'll see that in the logs, Heroku actually gives us the URL of our application. So I'm going to copy this URL and we're going to just open this up in the browser. And if you let this run long enough, you're eventually going to see an error. So it looks like something in our application is broken. And this is to be expected because there's still a few more things that we have to do to actually get this set up. Because if you take a look at what we've done, we pushed out our code to Heroku, right? But Heroku has no idea how to actually start our application. What is the command? It just knows that this is a Python app, but it doesn't know what it is. It doesn't know that it's a fast API app. It doesn't know that we're trying to build out an API. It has no idea. And when we deploy to our development environment, we ran uvcorn and then, app.main and then app, right? But we haven't given that command to Heroku. How does it have any idea that our code is in main.py and that within the main.py file, we have our app instance stored in a variable called app? It has no idea. So what we have to do is we actually have to create a file that's going to tell Heroku what is the exact command that we want to run. So inside your root directory, so just kind of collapse all the folders. Inside your root directory, so just right click here, create a new file, create a file called a proc file. So I've already got this in here. It's going to be in the GitHub repo, so you can take a look at it and make sure you capitalize the P. And actually, if you take a look at the tutorial and we go to the next one, which is define a proc file, this is going to just explain what the proc file is, but the proc file just tells Heroku what is the command that we need to start our application. And so here we give it a process type. So since this is a web application that's going to be responding to web requests, we want to use the word web, and then we specify the exact command that we need to run. And so in my proc file, a couple of things have been set up. So we run the command uvcorn app.main and then app like we've done before. We're not going to pass in the -- reload flag because this is production. We don't want it to automatically reload on changes because there should be no changes. We do have to provide the host IP. So this is just saying that, hey, we should be able to respond to requests to any IP. So whatever IP Heroku gives us, this is going to accept it. Then the next flag is going to be the port flag. So what port should we run this on? If we don't provide a port flag, then it's going to default to port 8000 like it always has. However, the thing about Heroku is that they're actually going to provide us a port. So we don't know what this port is ahead of time. So we have to be able to accept this port regardless of what it is. And so it's actually going to pass this down as an environment variable. So anytime you want to accept an environment variable or reference one, you can just say $ and then curly braces. So we're really just saying we want to take whatever value Heroku gives us with the environment variable of port, and we want to assign it here. And then this is just giving it a default value of 5000 if they don't provide one. However, Heroku will always provide a support, so I don't think we even need that. And so after you make this file, you're then going to have to push out these changes to Git once again. And since I already had this file, there's nothing to change in my Git, so nothing will get pushed out. So I'm just going to just change some random code. I'm going to delete this 1, 2, 3, 4 here so that I can at least have some changes in my code. You guys will already have changes in your code because you added the new file. So then go ahead and do a git add -- all. So that's going to add all the changes. We're going to do a commit. And we'll give it a message of added proc file. And then we do a git push. And then what do we push to? Well, first of all, moving forward, we want to make sure that this is stored in GitHub. So let's do a git push origin main. This is going to push it to GitHub. And then now we want to actually push out these changes to Heroku so that we can actually get our application up and running. So we'll do a git push Heroku main. And once again, we have to kind of wait through this entire process. Okay, so it's now finished. Once again, we're going to go back to the URL it's deployed at. And I'm just going to do a refresh to see if we fixed our issue. And the fact that it's still spinning for this long most likely means that we did not fix our issue. But I already know the exact reason why this is. And so we will take a look at exactly what is causing our application to not successfully get deployed in the next lesson. Anytime your application isn't working on Heroku's platform, they have a really easy way of accessing logs. So we can say Heroku logs, and then I'm just going to do a -- help just to see what options we have. And so here we could specify the app or we can just dump the logs for all of our apps. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to pass in the -t flag so we can tail the logs as things happen. So if I do a -t and we scroll up, you can see that we've got a couple of different errors. And so it looks like there's some issues with settings, which, is the Pydantic model that we've set up for retrieving our environment variables. And it's saying that there's a couple of validation errors for our settings model. And it says that, hey, look, we don't have a database hostname, we don't have a database port, password, or any of the other information. So there's some issue with our environment variables. And this makes sense because in development, we use our .env file to provide all of the environment variables into that settings model right here. And we pass that by specifying the env file. However, we did not check our env file into Git. Remember, in Git, we used the git ignore file to make sure we excluded that because we don't want to actually check that into Git. So how does Heroku know what all of our environment variables should be? Well, they have and so we actually have to add those environment variables either through the command line or through the dashboard. But before we can do that, we need to actually get a Postgres database because right now we don't have a Postgres database. So what would we even provide for database hostname and port and password and things like that if we don't have one? So let's create one. And once again, Heroku provides us with a free Postgres instance that we can have access to. And that's one of my favorite parts about Heroku is that now we have access to Postgres. So let's go to Heroku Postgres. And I'll just say tutorial. And this is going to take us to their dev center. So this is going to show us actually how to create a Postgres instance. And so Postgres is one of their many add-ons. If you want to actually go to their website and see all of the different add-ons they support a ton. If you want a Redis add-on, you can get that added. But in this case, we want to create a Postgres instance. So we do Heroku add-ons, create, then the type of add-on, which just means it's going to be PostgreSQL, and then plan name. So we are under the hobby dev, which is essentially the free one. And that's going to actually create a Postgres instance. So let's run this and just Control C out of this. And let's just do a -- help real quick, just to see what other flags we have. And that should be fine. We don't need to actually provide any other flags. So let's run this. And Heroku is actually going to create our Postgres instance. And keep in mind that for Heroku to spin up a Postgres instance, it does take a little bit of time, but we can actually monitor that in our dashboard. So if we go back to my dashboard and do a refresh, you can see that this is the new Heroku instance. And I can just click on this and we can see some more information. It's going to open this up in a new tab. And if you want to, we can go into these settings. And here we can take a look at our database credentials. So if I view my credentials, you can see that this is the IP address my database lives on. This is the actual database name. So we don't get to create our own database name or our own database within Postgres. They give us a fixed name, and that's perfectly fine. And then this is going to be the username that we're going to log in as. This is the port it's running on. And then this is our password. And they also provide us the full Postgres URL if we want to use that. So now that we have this information, feel free to save this real quick. And I'm actually just going to do a quick screenshot and save this in my notes so that I don't have to keep bouncing back and forth. And now let's go back to our application. And if we go under settings, this config vars is where we actually provide environment variables to our Heroku instance. And by the way, Heroku calls our instance dynos, but you can use either term you want. And so you could see all of the config variables that have been set, and there should be nothing except for one. So when you add a Postgres instance to your application, what happens is Heroku automatically adds an environment variable called database URL, and it's going to contain the entire Postgres URL. And so we could go into our application and then update our code so that in the database.py file, instead of breaking things down like this, we can just provide one specific URL and just put it in as settings.database_URL. However, I don't like to change my code. I like it just the way it is. So instead of using the default environment variable, we're going to actually break this URL out into multiple different environment variables. So just open this up and take a look at all of the environment variables that we expect by going into our config.py. So we need all of these set. So we're going to add one for database hostname. And from the URL, if you forgot what the host name is, and actually, I'm going to just open this one up in a new tab and then open up, actually, I don't even need to open up this one. I just need to flip between these two. So the host name is right here, but you can get it from this URL just by clicking on this icon and then just grabbing the IP address. But it's such a small little window. I hate having to do that. So I'm going to close that and just bounce between these two links. All right, so let's grab the host name. And we'll add this one. Then the next one is going to be the database port, password, name, and username. So let's just write those out. Database port, database username, database password, and then database name. I think that's it. Database port, password, name, username. And then we have to add the stuff for our token. So we got secret key, algorithm, and then the last one. And then now we can provide in the values. So the database port, we can see from here, it's going to be the default 5432. The username, and then here we'll grab the password. And then the actual database name here. The secret key, I'm just going to use whatever we used in development. Not actually recommended, but I'm just going to keep things as simple as possible for now. But you can provide any secret key you want. And I'll say in production, it'll expire after 60 minutes. All right, and so now we've got all of our environment variables set up, and our Postgres instance is already up and running. So I think at this point, our app should work. So we'll try this out again. So now that we set those new environment variables, how do we actually restart our Heroku instance? Well, let's do a Heroku apps -- help. And let's see if there's a restart. So there's app create, destroy, and it doesn't look like there's a restart. So we can't actually use the apps argument to restart our application. Instead, we have to do Heroku ps -- help. So now we can see that we do have access to restart. So we're going to do Heroku ps restart. And that's going to restart our dyno, which is our Heroku instance. And once again, I'm going to do a Heroku logs -t to tail the logs. All right, and so now you can see those previous errors are gone, and we were now able to successfully run the startup command. And you can see that we actually got past a specific port of 34731. And so that's why we ultimately had to provide the port variable, because this will change every time we restart it. However, we don't actually need to use that specific port number in the URL that we need to access. So let's get our app URL, which I already forgot. And if you ever forget your URL, you can just type in Heroku apps info, then the name of the specific app, And then it's going to give you all of the specific information. So you can see this is actually where the Heroku Git is being stored. We can see that we have one instance in this case running the web. And then we have our URL down here. So I'm going to copy this. And you can see that we get message hello world. So it looks like things are working. If I actually go to /docs, let's test that out. And so now we have access to documents. I'm going to minimize that. So it looks like things are working. However, if I try to log in, whether it's either through the documentation or if I actually send a request from Postman, you're going to see that there's going to be some issues. So here I'm going to actually, I can't even log in. I have to create a user first because this is a fresh deployment. So let's go to users and we're going to create a user real quick. And I'm going to just try this out and put in whatever name you want. Now, so this is sanjeev@example.com. My password will be password123. We'll execute it. And you can see that we get an internal server error. So what is happening? Why can't we exactly create a user? Well, like usual, we're going to go back to our logs and we're going to see what happened. All right, so we can see the SQL that's getting inputted in the logs, and it looks like there's some kind of error with the SQL. And I don't know if that's going to give us a more specific error that's going to actually help us. I think that's all it's going to provide us in this case. But I think you guys can guess exactly what's happening. We deployed a brand new instance of Postgres. But right now, if we actually connect to our Postgres, you're going to see a few different issues. So I'm going to actually connect to this Postgres instance. And to create a Postgres instance, just right click here and then select create server. So this is going to allow us to connect to another Postgres. And I'm going to call this Heroku-Postgres. And then here we're going to provide the same exact connection information. So we'll go back to settings. We'll get our credentials. Okay, and so now we are successfully connected to our Heroku Postgres instance. And if I just drop this down and then go into databases, you'll see a ton of different databases. Keep in mind, we won't actually be able to access most of these. So the reason Postgres is able to, the reason Heroku is actually able to provide this for free is that they have one instance of Postgres, and then they give you one database within that instance that you can access, but only you can access that specific database. And so our database is D58. And I don't know if there's an easy way to search for databases. Let me see if I can right click this. Nope, it doesn't look like there's an easy way. So I'm just gonna have to scroll down to D5. And then what are the next letters? D5, 8RE05. All right, so I finally found my database. You'll see it's the one that I have access to, so it's actually colored. And if I just open this up real quick, and go into schemas, public, and then tables, there's nothing in there. So that's really the reason why our application is not working, is because we have a brand new Postgres instance, but we haven't actually set up our tables or our schema. And so this is where Alembic is going to come into play once again. You'll see that since we already have all of our revisions set up, getting our production database to match our development database will be as simple as just running one simple command. So we'll take a look at that in the next video. In our development environment, we used Alembic to manage our database schema. So Alembic was responsible for creating all of those tables. And since we have all of these revision files within the Alembic folder, we can essentially track all the changes that we make. And so to actually get our development database up to date, we just ran Alembic upgrade head. And that would go to whichever one of these is the latest revision and make sure that our Postgres instance matched whatever that is. In our production database, because in our production database, it's going to be no different. We're going to just run Alembic upgrade head on our Heroku instance, and that's going to ensure that our Postgres database gets updated to our latest schema. And because we've checked all of these files into Git, because all of the Alembic folders was added to Git as well, that then our Heroku instance has access to all of our revisions. And so when we run Alembic, Alembic can keep track of all of those changes as well in our production server. And it's important to understand that we never run Alembic revision on our production server. We only run Alembic revision on our development server when we're staging out these changes. In our production server, whenever we want to push out those changes, we just do a git push. So we push out the code